I will speak briefly on this topic of defining reality. Misinformation, disinformation, and public engagement, our theme for today. The best place to start when we just discuss disinformation, misinformation is to define exactly what it is we're concerned about. I appreciate the poll. Our biggest concern are the disinformation, misinformation that's coming through social media, probably starting on social media and then moving into our county chambers, our city commissions, our city halls, our communities, our town meetings, and so on and so forth. So what starts on the social media doesn't stop on the social media. It moves into the quote unquote real world. But to start with the definition, I define disinformation, misinformation on two dimensions. One, the accuracy of the content that is shared and the intentionality of the person who is sharing it. So disinformation in its pure form is inaccurate content shared with a bad intent to manipulate somebody, to manipulate someone's ideas about what is accurate, what is not accurate, what is truthful, what is not truthful, in order to pursue some self-interested agenda, policy agenda, personal agenda, or something along those lines. Bad intent, inaccurate content joined together, that's disinformation. If we move upwards to other forms of disinformation that are shown in red, bad intent shared with vague content is information that is suggestive of something amiss in reality, something amiss in our policy discussions, something amiss in our political conversations, something amiss in governance issues of various kinds, but without really saying what is wrong, what is amiss, but giving that strong impression. That's something that my colleague and I, Sarah Stokel, label as disingenuous information. And then we have information that is accurate technically, but shared with a bad intent, meaning it's just a fragment of a statistic, a piece of a puzzle that doesn't represent the whole context of a situation. And that is shared that in a way that we call distracting information, is trying to change the agenda by sharing something that's technically accurate and unimpeachable from that perspective, but without the context that provides the full scope of the discussion. That's all with bad intent. The good intent, and what I think is most concerning for us in our communities, is the misinformation. Individuals, our neighbors, our friends, our colleagues, people we work with, who might be susceptible to the disinformation, is susceptible to certain phrases, certain emotional appeals, certain logics that are presented, certain words that are presented, but they don't share in order to pursue their own agenda. They share because they think they're sharing the information that they believe to be true and accurate in order to strengthen the community, to strengthen the policy, to strengthen the neighborhood, and so on. So the distinction between the dis and the misinformation is the intentionality, largely, of the person who is sharing it. So misinformation, good intent, inaccurate content, misguided information we label as good intent, and vague content. And then that last category of missing information is good intent, accurate content. We call it missing because it's often drowned out in the noise, particularly on social media. But once this gets off social media as well, it's drowned out by all the bad stuff, by the distracting, the disingenuous, the misguided, the missing information is absent. And so when we think about the role of local government, we have to think about how can we, as government and with our partners across sectors, lift up those voices that are sharing the good information with accurate content. That's the part of the goal. Now, my colleague and I, Sarah Stokel, who's an elected member of the Titusville, Florida City Council, and someone who presents with me regularly with ICMA and other bodies on this topic, we developed a checklist, a combat disinformation checklist, which I'll walk through in some detail here in just a moment. But I'll just leave one sort of key takeaway here, which is when you think about how to combat disinformation, the most important thing to know is you are not alone as government. That in order to effectively combat disinformation and misinformation, you have to engage your allies in government, in nonprofit, in business, in universities, and schools, and faith organizations, and so on. So there's one takeaway out of my brief time here. It's you're not alone in dealing with this. You should not act alone to try to combat disinformation. Use and leverage the resources and relationships across other sectors in order to combat the disinformation, misinformation, and heal the community once it's divided because of it. The other thing that's important to keep in mind before I walk through the checklist in a little bit more detail is that the division that is in communities that leads to the spread of disinformation and misinformation, and that also exacerbates the harm that comes to our communities because of the spread of the disinformation and misinformation. That polarization is, when we look closely at it, it really doesn't exist in the extremes that we are given the impression that it does. That most people are interested in dialogue. They're interested in learning on the extreme. Put that graphically, as we think about any issue, either uninformed on the issue or informed on the issue, but they're in that center. They're not on the extreme on the left side or the right side. We have that pinkish color who are more susceptible to being persuaded by the disinformation spreaders, by those with bad intent. And so those are the groups. That pink body is the group that we should be most concerned with to try to capture them away before they're infected by the disinformation. Our goal in fighting or combating disinformation is not to feed the extremes, to maintain credibility with all sides so as to maintain legitimacy and to be seen as a valued, trusted voice as we try to correct the misinformation and disinformation. And we want to grow that informed center, that bottom part of the gray box that's green and white. Now, there are a few strategies that we can pursue, generally speaking, to do nothing, which is not recommended. You do nothing, then the loudest voice wins. You have a growth in the extreme, and that center just shrinks as one extreme potentially gets larger, and those who are susceptible to the disinformation get sucked into that extreme position. Then you've got a strategy of fact checking, which can be very, very dangerous. That's the sort of the knee-jerk reaction. Let's put good information out there, flood the airwaves and the social media with good information. But to do that without being sensitive to the language or the concerns or the emotional connections to those who are on the extremes or susceptible to the extremes could lead to a growth in one side or the other, could lead to an increase in distrust, which will only hurt the long-term success and sustainability of the relationships you want to have with members of your community. So what we want to do is to pursue some kind of a dialogue and education process and grow that center. Now I can go more on any of these items, and my colleague Sarah and I do in a 2-hour or 4-hour version of this workshop go into much more detail. But this gives you a sense of the dynamics that exist and what the challenges in trying to address these issues. Now, quickly, just walking through the checklist components here. It's written into a few different steps, written as questions. How should we identify the target of disinformation? How should we react to disinformation? How should we counter disinformation? So forth and so on. I invite you to take a screenshot of this, or we can, I'm sure, make this PowerPoint available to you. This video will be made available to you, and use this checklist as a tool for setting up your own response within government, as well as your response in collaboration with others. Again, the most important thing to keep in mind is that you are not alone as government and should not be seen as acting alone to try to combat the disinformation, because once it spreads, it divides the community, and that's bad for business, that's bad for faith organizations, that's bad for schools, that's bad for nonprofits and neighborhood associations. So as we combat and address issues, it's not government going onto social media and trying hand-to-hand social media combat. This is leveraging the resources, the networks, the relationships within your whole community, using the networks using the social media pages, using the in-person conversations that exist across the community in order to move forward and heal the community.
All right, so Team Norwalk, I'm going to welcome you to the stage. Ask you to share your experience.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us here today. It's very interesting to sway into the conversation after the presentation, because there's a lot of particularly within the budget process that we do is one to look at different avenues in which we inform our community about budgetary process, but most importantly, ensure that there is no mis or disinformation being disseminated about the process. And if you look at the demographics of Norwalk is a very diverse community that has had a growing population of non-English speaking members. So one of the things we've done is, first and foremost, provided information in their language and made sure that the public has access to the budgetary as not only in written form, but also that they can be active participants of the process. So not only do we break language barrier, but we utilize an array of different avenues to provide information through social media, through community-based conversations, as well as school-based conversations, because we have gradually transitioned our budgets to become a school-based budgeting process. So we have school bodies within each building that so engage the process in a really thoughtful and thorough way, making sure that not only we're looking at work at a district capacity, but also looking at within our schools, getting the voices and perspective of our families, community members, and utilizing all of these avenues and resources to actively engage and inform our families. Lunda, do you want to add?
Sure. Thank you for that intro, Dr. Estrella. So along that point, most of our obviously public engagement, at least for the purpose of this discussion, is through the budget process. And one of the things that we've done, and I like the slide, the dialogue and education process that was shared earlier. So one of the things that we've also engaged to do is to address some of the disinformation and the education is using different media outlets as well. You know, the traditional public hearing where they come to a town hall at 7 o'clock in the evening is not necessarily the best way for everyone. And so some other things that we've looked at is using social media. So as Dr. Estrella mentioned, because of the languages that are spoken within the district, we did a two-prong approach. One, we used Facebook Live as an alternative to engagement, but then we also did Facebook Live in Spanish so that we could engage the non-English speakers in our community just to provide that effective and accurate information using various forms of media, and also engaging with our schools as well, with our schools governance councils, and engaging with them directly as well. It seems we have some audio problems I'm seeing in the comments, but yeah, that's what I wanted to add to that. So thanks for the opportunity to share.
Now, Linda, your audio is great. I think we were just having some problems with Thomas, and then there was a little echo with Dr. Estrella, but you were sounding good. And Thomas is back and has shared in the links some of the information he was trying to communicate at the end there. So thank you for that, Thomas. And with that, Cameron, I'd like to hand it over to you for making some observations as our discussant, and we'll.
Great, thank you. Well, so I have a couple of observations. First, I thought it was an important distinction that Thomas made up at the top around the difference between misinformation and disinformation, and the focus that communities need to have really is on the misinformation. It's the kind of information that spreads more widely, it's more prevalent. In all of our research, that's what we see. And so I think it's a really important issue to hammer home. It was at the very beginning of this, but it's something I think everyone needs to take away, is that there are pockets of bad actors who are intentionally trying to mislead people, but that's the minority of the problem. The majority of the problem is really things that people don't recognize they're perpetuating, or things that are soft mis and disinformation, right? Flaws in logic and things like that. So I think that that's a really critical starting point for how we think about what areas to focus on. I also think that the approach that was outlined for how to tackle this problem, that goes from small, do nothing, to attempting to use fact checks, but then really focusing on thinking about education and engaging with the community is the logical pathway. It's the one that we've seen. I want to call out something I think that was mentioned up at the very top that resonates with me quite a lot in a different context, which is last year, the Surgeon General of the United States released the first advisory of the current administration, and that advisory was on health misinformation, on misinformation related to vaccines and COVID-19. And the top line point of that advisory was that addressing mis and disinformation has to be a whole of society response, right? It's not a challenge that can be addressed from the top down. It can't be only tackled by the federal government. It can't be only tackled by mainstream media or social media companies, right? It's something that we all have to participate in. And so I think embedded in the approach that Thomas laid out is the idea that we need to engage communities in tackling this directly, on leveling up their own skills about recognizing and learning to tell the difference, about understanding the ways in which they have to think critically about the information that they receive. I think that's like a critical starting point, regardless of the scale of or the topic of mis and disinformation that you're trying to tackle. Then I want to sort of think about to move into a question and talk to sort of Dr. Australia and Linda Osmani about what is like a practical challenge that you faced, and how did you tackle it? And did you think about the kinds of strategies that Thomas presented? Is there something that you can share that paints a picture, like A to Z, that you think would be meaningful for everyone else?
So I think one example that I can give at the beginning of the budget process, we know that there were a number of families that were absent in the conversation, and we're only being guided by social media posts that different community members or families posting, but a lot of this information was not necessarily accurate. So we decided to host a Facebook Live conversation with the community, one, to talk about the process, to offer the opportunity to engage in the conversation, and that they were able to actively engage and communicate in, and then two, provide them an understanding of the ways in which they could become active members in the process. Because for many members of the community here, they didn't feel that they could actively participate, and I articulated earlier, a lot stem from the language barriers that existed, and we had to embed different processes to break that barrier, but then also educate and inform the community about resources that were out there and could access those resources so that they can be in the process and be well informed of the processes. One, by providing them information of where we post documents and resources that speak to the process and were in the process, and also where did they have opportunities to then engage and provide their common perspective and their perspectives in the process.
Understood. I see there was a question in the chat that I'll just read out loud briefly, which is that purposefully vague or one-sided presentations by local government using a rationale of keeping it simple, it's sometimes hard to look in the mirror. One election official used to often ask me, can I say something factually true but intended to mislead and make him look good? I guess I would put it back to you all and ask, how do you think about the balance between making something simple and making something contain enough information so that it does not have the risk of misleading folks?
Sure. Let me jump in on that. This is Tom Breyer. If I've come in with my phone here, hopefully improve my connectivity. So the question raised a couple of points. One is the difference between the vagueness and the simplicity and more detailed information that could make accessibility more challenging. And the other is the relationship with the elected official. On the second point, this is where my colleague Sarah Sokol and I spend quite a bit of time, as she is an elected member of a city council. She thinks quite often and a lot and intensively about how she likes to work with city managers and with other unelected civil servants who work in local government. How does she want to receive information from them? How does she want to ensure that she is speaking in an accessible and honest and truthful manner? And from her experience, of course, there are some exceptions with certain elected officials, but most elected officials do want to provide good information. And so what she recommends is to set up a system where you provide regular talking points on all the critical issues that are out in the media that are being discussed, so that they have some clear language to share with their constituents that they can put out under their name, but the information that they know is accurate and true, and so on. So make sure you have that dialogue with your elected officials to say, how do you want to receive information from us? And then with respect to the simplicity of the message, starting simple is great because it allows simple accessibility, but you should always provide a detailed back end to that simplicity. So if there is a quick tweet length response to something that you might deliver, make sure that you have a static web page or some other announcement for an upcoming meeting or something where more information, the full detail of the information you're trying to present is made available. And so you don't stop at simplicity because that's where the level of attention might be for some constituents, but that's your gateway, and you drive people to the more complete information, always keeping in mind that you want to communicate in an accessible, transparent manner, free from jargon and so on.
So we used two approaches last year. I think one, to kind of preempt the questions. There's some questions that we know of, we are aware of. So we do like a frequently asked questions type to kind of preempt and answer some of those basic questions or sources of misinformation, disinformation, or things that we think that people don't really understand about the business that we're in. And then I think the other thing too is just the approach of sharing the information. We use telling our story is a strategy we use, is basically use it in the context of storytelling. What do we do? Why do we exist? And that's kind of how you get into some of these deeper conversations that Thomas is talking about with the backup and the data. But initially, you start by just kind of like a broad storytelling of ourselves before we get into the granular level detail.